3 days before my neighbor was supposed to close on the sale of his house, I found out he'd been advertising my property as if it belonged to him. And the worst part wasn't that he used it in the photos. The worst part was that buyers actually believed they were getting it. Looking back now, I can honestly say that if one friend hadn't sent me a random text message on a Tuesday afternoon, none of this would have happened. The sale would have gone through, the buyers would have moved in, and somebody else's mistake would have eventually become my nightmare. My name's Ethan Harper, and for almost 12 years I've lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Asheville, North Carolina, called Cedar Creek Estates. It's one of those places where people still wave when they drive past, where retirees spend way too much money on bird feeders, and where every piece of gossip somehow travels faster than internet service. I liked it there. Life was predictable, and honestly, I like predictable. I work from home, I drink too much coffee, I mow my lawn every Saturday whether it needs it or not. And until all this happened, the most exciting thing on my street was usually somebody forgetting trash day. Then there was my neighbor. His name was Trevor Lawson. Now, Trevor wasn't a bad guy in the way movie villains are bad. He wasn't evil. He wasn't cruel. He was something far more common. He was obsessed with appearances. You ever meet somebody who spends so much time trying to look successful that they forget to actually become successful? That was Trevor. When he moved in about 7 years ago, he arrived driving a luxury SUV that somehow got replaced every 18 months with a newer one. He always seemed to be renovating something. New stone facade, fancy outdoor lighting, imported landscaping. One year he even installed a decorative fountain in his front yard that looked like it belonged outside a casino. The thing never worked correctly. For 6 months it sounded like a dying washing machine, but Trevor loved it because from the street it looked expensive. His house itself wasn't terrible, nice enough, but compared to newer developments nearby it lacked certain things buyers cared about. Most importantly, it didn't have a private driveway. The property sat on a narrow corner lot. There was room for street parking, but that was it. Meanwhile, right beside his property sat my driveway. Wide, clean, curving gently toward my garage. At night, low stone lights lined the edge. My wife used to joke that the driveway looked nicer than the actual house, and from certain angles, especially from the road, it almost looked connected to Trevor's property. Almost, but not really. The property line was crystal clear, at least to anybody who cared enough to look. Over the years, Trevor developed a habit of treating boundaries more like suggestions than actual rules. A few examples. One summer, his nephew asked to park on my driveway during a graduation weekend. A weekend turned into 11 days. Another time, roofing contractors hired by Trevor stacked materials halfway across my driveway without asking. When I complained, Trevor laughed and said, "Come on, Ethan, neighbors help neighbors." Funny thing about that phrase, it always seemed to benefit Trevor, never anyone else. Still, none of those incidents were serious enough to start a war over. They were just tiny irritations. Little pebbles inside a shoe, the kind you tolerate because life is easier that way. Then came the Zillow listing. The whole thing started because my friend Nate texted me one afternoon. He sent a screenshot and wrote, "Dude, when did you start selling driveway rights?" I stared at the message for a second, then I clicked the link. The second the listing loaded, my stomach dropped. There it was, front and center. The main image, beautiful golden sunset lighting, warm colors, professional editing, and right in the middle of the frame, my driveway. Not part of it, not accidentally visible in the background. My driveway was the star of the photo. The angle made it appear as though it naturally belonged to Trevor's house. I zoomed in, then zoomed in again. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a weird camera angle. But then I kept scrolling. Second photo, driveway. Third photo, driveway. Third photo, driveway. Fourth photo. And then I reached the property description. That's where my irritation became something else entirely. The listing described a home as featuring private off-street parking with convenient multi-vehicle access. I read that sentence 3 times. Private off-street parking, convenient multi-vehicle access. They weren't just showing my property, they were selling it. I sat back in my chair and honestly laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes when something is ridiculous enough, laughing is the only available response. That evening I showed my wife Claire. She stared at the screen, then looked at me, then looked back at the screen. "That's definitely your driveway." "Yep." "They can't do that. I don't think they can either." Claire asked what I planned to do. At first, nothing dramatic. I assumed it was a mistake. A misunderstanding. Maybe the realtor didn't know where the property line was. Maybe the photographer got carried away. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I emailed the listing agent. Politely. Very politely. I introduced myself, explained the driveway belonged entirely to my property, attached a survey, requested they remove the photos and update the description. No threats, no accusations, no attitude. Then I waited. 1 day, nothing. 2 days, nothing. 3 days, nothing. 3 days, still nothing. The listing remained exactly the same. Actually, it got worse. Open house signs started appearing. Every weekend, strangers wandered through the neighborhood looking at Trevor's house. One Saturday morning, I was drinking coffee on my front porch when a young couple walked halfway out my driveway. They looked excited, happy, the way people look when they're imagining a future. I stood up and asked if I could help them. The woman smiled. "We're here for the Lawson showing." I nodded. Then she pointed behind her. We were told this was shared access. For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. Shared access? She nodded. That's what the realtor said. I looked past them. The realtor was standing near Trevor's front porch. The second our eyes met, she suddenly became very interested in her phone. That was the moment something changed inside me, because misunderstandings happen. Mistakes happen, but this wasn't a mistake anymore. Now they knew, and they kept doing it anyway. That night I pulled every property document I owned from a filing cabinet in my office. Survey maps, closing paperwork, boundary records, county documents, everything. I spread it all across the dining room table while Claire watched from the kitchen. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked. "Honestly?" I sighed. "I'm hoping to find out I'm wrong. Because if I was wrong, life would be easier. But I wasn't." Every document confirmed the same thing. The driveway belonged entirely to my parcel. No easements, no shared use agreements, no access rights, nothing. Legally speaking, Trevor's property had absolutely no claim to it, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At the top of the Zillow page, the status had changed. Under contract, someone had already agreed to buy the house. I stared at that little red banner for a long time, because suddenly this wasn't just about Trevor anymore. There were buyers involved now, real people. People who might be spending $500,000 based on information that wasn't true. And for the first time, I started wondering whether staying quiet would make me part of the problem. What I didn't know then was that just a few days later, I was about to walk into a closing office downtown and accidentally bring an entire real estate transaction to a complete stop. The funny thing is, even after seeing that under contract banner, I still wasn't completely sure what I was going to do. For the next couple days, I kept arguing with myself. 1 minute I'd be convinced I needed to get involved. The next minute I'd tell myself to stay out of it. After all, maybe the buyers already knew. Maybe there was some explanation I hadn't heard. Maybe I was about to become that guy, the bitter neighbor who couldn't let something go. But every time I started talking myself out of it, I'd remember that young couple standing in my driveway. We were told this was shared access, not asking, not assuming, told. That part kept bothering me. Then Wednesday morning I got the piece of information that changed everything, and naturally it came from Linda Pearson. Every neighborhood has one. The unofficial information network. The woman who somehow knows things before the people involved know them. Linda lived 3 houses down and spent half a day gardening and the other half somehow collecting intelligence. I was rolling my trash can back toward the garage when she called out from across the street. "So you happy Trevor's finally moving?" I laughed. "I'll believe it when the moving truck shows up." "Oh, it's happening," she said confidently. "They're signing tomorrow morning." I stopped walking. "What do you mean signing?" "The closing. Downtown. Blue Ridge title. 10:30. Then she went right back to trimming flowers like she hadn't just dropped a grenade into my day. I thanked her and walked inside. Claire took one look at my face and immediately knew something had happened. "What?" I sat down at the kitchen table. "The closing is tomorrow." She stared at me. "And?" I looked toward the stack of survey documents sitting on the counter, then back at her, then finally said the thing I'd been avoiding. "I think I'm going." For a few seconds, she didn't respond. Then she asked the question I already knew was coming. "Are you sure?" "No, not even a little." That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining every possible outcome. Maybe I'd walk in and discover there had been a misunderstanding all along. Maybe I'd embarrass myself. Maybe I'd make enemies. Maybe I'd ruin somebody's life. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself staring at the ceiling thinking about something my father used to say. If the truth creates a problem, the truth isn't the problem. At the time, it sounded like one of those annoying dad sayings, but laying there in the dark, it suddenly felt relevant. The next morning, I got dressed, grabbed my folder, and drove downtown. The entire drive felt surreal. Halfway there, I almost turned around. Twice. I'm not a confrontational person. I never have been. Some people seem energized by conflict. Trevor was one of those people. I'm the opposite. I avoid arguments. I overthink everything. I replay conversations in my head for days afterward. But there comes a point where avoiding conflict starts feeling worse than facing it. And somewhere between Cedar Creek Estates and downtown Asheville, I crossed that line. Blue Ridge title sat inside an old brick building near the courthouse square. Nothing fancy. Neutral-colored walls, fake plants, bad coffee. The kind of place where people make life-changing decisions while sitting in uncomfortable chairs. I walked through the front door at 10:15 and immediately saw Trevor. The second his eyes landed on me, I knew one thing. He knew exactly why I was there. His entire expression changed. Not confusion, not surprise, panic, just for a split second. Then it disappeared. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Not hello, not good morning. Straight to that, I held up the folder. Need to clear up a property issue before paperwork gets finalized. His jaw tightened instantly. "Ethan, now isn't the time." I almost laughed. "Funny. I felt the same way when I emailed your realtor." That landed. I could see it. Trevor stepped closer and lowered his voice. "You're seriously doing this?" "No," I replied calmly. "I'm correcting something." Before he could answer, a receptionist looked up from behind the desk. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Trevor immediately jumped in. "Everything's fine." I smiled politely. "Actually, I need to speak with whoever is handling the Lawson closing regarding a potential property representation issue." The effect was immediate. The receptionist's smile disappeared. Professionals in real estate hear certain phrases differently than normal people. Potential property representation issue was apparently one of them. "One moment, please." She disappeared down a hallway. Trevor looked like he wanted to strangle me. "You could have called." "I did. You know what I mean." "No," I said. "I actually don't." A minute later, a woman in her 50s appeared. Professional. Calm. The kind of person who had probably seen every version of human drama imaginable. She introduced herself as Melissa and invited us into a conference room. The buyers were already inside. The same couple I'd seen at the open house. The husband looked tired. The wife looked excited. At least she did for the first 30 seconds. Then we sat down. Melissa asked me to explain my concern. Trevor immediately interrupted. "It's just a misunderstanding about neighboring property lines." I opened my folder. "It's actually not." Then I slid the survey across the table. Melissa picked it up. The husband leaned forward. The wife did too. I pointed at the diagram. "This driveway shown throughout the listing belongs entirely to my property." Silence. Real silence. Not dramatic movie silence. The uncomfortable kind. The husband frowned. "What do you mean?" I pointed again. "The driveway isn't attached to Trevor's property. It never has been." The wife looked confused. "But the listing said." She stopped. Didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Everybody knew what she was about to say. Trevor forced a laugh. "Come on, let's not overcomplicate this." I turned toward him, then explained the listing description. His smile vanished. Melissa started flipping through paperwork. The husband rubbed his forehead, slowly, like somebody solving a puzzle they wished didn't exist. Then came the question. The one that changed everything. "So, legally speaking," he said carefully, "if we buy this house, can we use that driveway?" Nobody spoke. Trevor looked at Melissa. Melissa looked at Trevor. The wife looked at both of them. Finally, I answered, "No." The word hit the room like a brick. The wife's eyes widened. "What?" I kept my voice calm. "There is no shared access agreement. No easement. No. No legal parking rights. No." The husband leaned back in his chair, hard, like the air had left his body. Then he looked directly at Trevor. "Did you know that?" Trevor hesitated, just for a second. But sometimes a single second tells you everything. "Well," he began. Wrong answer. The moment he said "well," the room changed. Everyone felt it. The confidence was gone. The story was cracking. Melissa flipped another page. "Mr. Lawson, were any documents provided supporting driveway access?" Trevor swallowed. "No." "Was any disclosure made clarifying ownership?" Silence. Longer this time. Then he finally said it. "I assumed people understood." The husband actually laughed, not because he thought it was funny, because he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You assumed?" Nobody answered. Then the wife asked a question so simple it was devastating. If we parked there after moving in, could he have our vehicles towed? I looked directly at her. "Yes," Trevor exploded. "Oh, come on." His chair scraped loudly against the floor. "That's ridiculous." I turned toward him for the first time since entering the room. "No, Trevor." My voice stayed calm. His didn't. "Ridiculous is trying to sell somebody else's driveway." The room went dead silent. Again. But this time it felt different. Heavier. Permanent. Across the table, I saw something happen to the buyers. It was subtle. Almost invisible. But trust left the room. And once trust leaves a real estate deal, it rarely comes back. Trevor looked around desperately. At Melissa. At the buyers. At me. At anyone who might rescue him. Nobody did. Then the husband asked one final question, and this one hit harder than all the others combined. He looked directly at Trevor and said, "When exactly were you planning to tell us?" Trevor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I realized something. He never thought he'd get caught. Not really. He thought everybody would stay polite, stay quiet, stay uncomfortable, because that's what most people do. And for years, he'd been right. What happened next would completely derail the closing, expose details nobody in that room expected to hear, and force Trevor to finally admit why he'd taken the risk in the first place. For a few seconds after the husband asked that question, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room felt frozen. Trevor stood there staring at the conference table, while the buyers looked at him like they'd never met him before. And honestly, that was the exact moment the entire thing stopped being about a driveway. Up until then, this had been a property dispute, a boundary issue, a legal problem. Now it was something else. Now it was about trust. Melissa finally broke the silence. She closed the file in front of her and folded her hands together. "I think we need to pause this closing until the representations made in the listing can be fully reviewed." The husband's eyes closed. The wife looked down at the table. Trevor looked like he'd been punched. "Pause," he said. Melissa nodded. "Yes, over a driveway." "No," she replied calmly. "Over information that may have materially affected the buyer's decision." There it was, materially affected. Real estate language, serious language, the kind that immediately changes the temperature in a room. Trevor's realtor finally jumped in. Her name was Rebecca. And up until that point, she'd mostly been sitting quietly, hoping the problem would somehow disappear on its own. Now she started talking fast, very fast. She explained that marketing photos were sometimes imperfect, that buyers were expected to perform due diligence, that misunderstandings occasionally occurred during property transactions. To be fair, she sounded convincing, for about 30 seconds. Then Melissa asked one question. "Did the listing describe private off-street parking?" Rebecca stopped talking, because everybody in the room already knew the answer. The husband let out a slow breath, then looked directly at Trevor. "Did you know there wasn't any legal access?" Trevor stared at the table. Again, no answer. The wife shook her head, almost like she was disappointed in herself for believing him. Then she said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "We already sold our house. Nobody responded." What do you even say to that? They had planned their future around this purchase, packed boxes, scheduled movers, made financial decisions, all based on information they trusted. And suddenly they were realizing that trust might have been misplaced. The husband stood up, not angry, not dramatic, just exhausted. He gathered his paperwork and looked at Trevor one last time. Then he said, "I don't think we're buying your house." Simple, calm, final. And somehow that was worse than yelling. The deal wasn't officially dead yet, but everyone in that room knew what had just happened. The foundation had collapsed. The rest was only paperwork. A few minutes later, the buyers left. Melissa disappeared into another office carrying documents. Rebecca followed behind her, looking like someone calculating legal exposure in real time. And then suddenly, it was just me and Trevor. Alone. The conference room felt strangely quiet. Cold coffee cups sat untouched. Folders remained scattered across the table. The closing that was supposed to happen 30 minutes earlier looked more like the aftermath of an accident. Trevor sank into a chair. For the first time in years, he didn't look confident. He looked tired, really tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep. The kind that comes from carrying something too long. He stared at the wall, then finally spoke. "You could have handled this privately." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. I tried. "You could have called me. I emailed. You know what I mean." "No," I said. "Actually, I don't." He rubbed both hands across his face. "You embarrassed me." That one hung in the air for a second. Then I answered, "No, Trevor." I leaned forward slightly. "You embarrassed yourself." For a moment I thought he might argue. Instead, he just looked away. And that's when something unexpected happened. The fight left him, completely, like a balloon losing air. His shoulders dropped, his expression softened, and suddenly he looked 10 years older. Maybe more. A long silence passed before he spoke again. When he did, his voice sounded different, quieter. "I was running out of options." That wasn't what I expected. I stayed silent. He stared out the conference room window toward the parking lot. "When I bought that house," he said, "I thought I'd flip it eventually." I listened. The market was hot. Everybody was making money. He laughed bitterly. Then rates changed. Another pause. "My renovation costs doubled." Pause. "My wife left." Longer pause. "I started borrowing money trying to keep everything together. For the first time since I'd known him, Trevor wasn't performing. There was no audience left, no image to maintain. Just truth, raw and uncomfortable." He continued, "I kept thinking if I could just sell it for enough, I could reset everything." I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit, not the specific situation, the desperation behind it, the desire to solve one problem before it creates 3 more. Then he said the thing that finally explained everything. "The realtor suggested using those photos." I looked at him. "You knew it was wrong." He nodded, very slowly. "Yeah, you did it anyway." Another nod. I figured nobody would check. That sentence hit harder than anything else he'd said because it was honest, brutally honest, not malicious, not evil, just selfish. One compromise, one shortcut, one bad decision, then another and another, until eventually he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. Eventually, I stood up, gathered my folder, and headed for the door. Before I left, Trevor asked one final question. "So what happens now?" I looked back at him, and for once, I didn't have an answer. Because real life doesn't wrap everything up neatly. There wasn't some dramatic ending waiting outside. There was just consequence. Messy, complicated consequence. Over the next few weeks, the story spread through Cedar Ridge faster than wildfire. Of course it did. Small towns treat drama like a competitive sport. By the second week, people had started recognizing me at the grocery store. One guy actually pointed and said, "Hey, you're the driveway guy." I wish I were kidding. The title followed me for months. As for Trevor's house, the listing disappeared shortly afterward, then reappeared several weeks later. Every driveway photo was gone. Every single one. The description had changed too. Now it talked about ample street parking opportunities, which is realtor language for good luck. The original buyers never came back. I don't blame them. Neither would you. A couple months later, rumors started circulating. Financial trouble, missed payments, contractors unpaid, things most of us had only guessed before. Then one morning a moving truck showed up, not because Trevor sold the house, because he had reached some kind of distress agreement with an investor. Within a few weeks he was gone. Just like that, the fountain stayed longer than he did. Funny enough, the house sat empty for nearly 6 months. Then eventually a young family bought it. Their first weekend in the neighborhood, the husband walked over carrying a bottle of bourbon. We introduced ourselves, talked for a few minutes. Then he smiled and said, "So just to be absolutely clear." I already knew where this was going. He pointed toward my driveway. "That's definitely yours, right?" I laughed. He laughed. Claire laughed from the porch. And for the first time in nearly a year, the whole thing felt ridiculous instead of stressful. But every now and then, usually late at night when everything's quiet and the neighborhood has gone to sleep, I still think about Trevor. Not because I miss him, and not because I regret what happened. I think about how easy it is for people to blur lines when they're scared, when they're desperate, when they're trying to protect an image they've spent years building. Trevor didn't wake up one morning planning some elaborate scam. At least I don't think he did. What happened was smaller than that. More human, one bad decision at a time, one justification at a time, one compromise at a time, until eventually he convinced himself that borrowing reality was the same thing as owning it. And maybe that's why this story stayed with me, because the driveway was never really the point. The point was boundaries. Legal boundaries, personal boundaries. The moment where being polite stops being the same thing as being passive. A lot of people avoid conflict because they want peace. I know I do. But sometimes avoiding conflict doesn't create peace. Sometimes it just creates space for dishonesty to grow, and that's the part I still wrestle with. Because depending on who you ask, I'm either the guy who protected innocent buyers from making a huge mistake, or I'm the neighbor who destroyed a man's last chance to save himself. I've heard both arguments. Some people say I absolutely did the right thing. Others say I should have stayed out of it and let the buyers figure it out later. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been sitting where I was, holding proof that a house was being sold under false assumptions, would you have walked into that closing room? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed quiet and let the transaction happen? Drop your opinion in the comments. Because honestly, after everything that happened, I still see people passionately arguing both sides of this story, and I'd love to know where you stand.